It was a cool January evening in 2018 when a single light flickered on inside the pale gray house at 138 North Avenida Madera in Paris, California. The street was quiet. A light breeze rustled the leaves on the oak trees lining the cul-de-sac. Neighbors closed their curtains early, and the only sounds were distant dogs barking and a car rolling by. On the outside, this house looked no different from the others. Trimmed hedges, a tidy driveway, a welcome mat that read, "Home Sweet Home." Inside lived David and Louise Turpin and their 13 children, ranging in age from 2 to 17. To the outside world, they were a devout Christian family who homeschooled their kids, attended church on Sundays, and shared cheerful pictures on social media. Their posts showed smiling children in matching outfits, papier-mâché craft projects, and visits to the zoo. Nothing in those photos hinted at the terror hidden behind closed doors. Each morning the children rose before dawn. They washed quickly, if they were allowed to wash at all, and dressed in the clothes their parents provided. David and Louise inspected every hem, every button, every ribbon. A loose thread or an uneven fold meant punishment. In the kitchen, the children sat at a long table in strict silence. A single metal spoon slid into each child's hand, and a metal bowl with a meager portion of cereal was placed before them. No talking, no laughter. If a spoon scraped against the bowl too loudly, the offending child was ordered to remain at the table long after everyone else had left. After breakfast, books lay open on the table. Instead of reading for fun, the children worked through a strict curriculum of religious study, math drills, and spelling tests. No friends came over for study groups, no field trips, no break for recess or play. The walls of the house were painted in soft pastel colors, but the air felt heavy, as if the paint itself was stifling any echo of joy. By mid-afternoon, the older children helped care for the younger ones, squeezing toothpaste, tying shoelaces, lifting toddlers into high chairs, always under watchful eyes. If a toddler cried, a teenager might be forced to hold the child tight until the tears stopped, even if it lasted hours. No one ever mentioned their own pain or discomfort. To speak of it was to risk being sent away alone. Louise Turpin kept a journal in which she recorded every infraction and every punishment. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of her writing late at night through a narrow window. Sometimes the entries were simple. Anna spoke without permission, 2 hours solitary. Other times they described the chaining of a child's ankle to the bedpost, or the rationing of food to teach self-control. David, once a successful dental surgeon, stood by Louise's side. He maintained their system of rules was necessary to keep the children pure and obedient. Over the years, the routine grew even harsher. Meals changed from plain cereal to thin soups and dry rice, barely enough to keep bodies moving. Showers became privileges, not routines. Some children went weeks without being allowed to bathe. Their hair matted, their skin cracked and dusty. When they did wash, it was under cold water for only a minute or two, before Louise snapped, "Time's up," and turned off the faucet. At bedtime, the younger children were led to small, bare rooms with thin mattresses on the floor. The older ones had slightly larger rooms, but the sheets had holes and the blankets were threadbare. If any child tried to curl up with a stuffed animal or pillow, it was confiscated as an act of self-indulgence. Doors were shut and locked from the outside. In some rooms, iron chains bolted to the floor clinked softly whenever the child shifted position. Yet despite the cruelty, the Turpins managed to keep up appearances. They attended church services every Sunday, sitting politely in the front pew. Neighbors waved when they passed in the driveway, and the Turpins always waved back with calm smiles. Invitations to birthday parties or community barbecues were politely declined. "Our children have special lessons," David would say. "Maybe next time." And no one pressed them further. There were tiny cracks in the façade. In 2013, a delivery driver recalled seeing a young boy wandering barefoot down the street at dusk. The child's eyes were blank and his pajamas dragged on the ground. The driver thought he was lost. He approached, but the boy wouldn't speak. So the driver knocked on the Turpin's door and explained what he had seen. David opened the door and smiled. "Oh, that's Michael," he said. "He likes late-night walks. Everything's fine." The driver nodded uneasily and drove away. 2 years later, a social worker arrived at the Turpin home with a packet of free science books and worksheets. She had gotten a tip from a concerned teacher who couldn't find any records of the Turpins' homeschooling. The social worker knocked. No answer. She slipped the packet under the door and left a business card. But when she tried to follow up a week later, the card was gone, and the envelope remained unopened. The social worker recorded the visit, marked, "No welfare concerns," and moved on, believing the Turpins were simply private people. Neighbors sometimes remarked on the eerie silence. One family who lived 2 houses down said they never heard laughter, never saw the children playing in the yard. "In all my years here," the neighbor said later, "I never heard a single child's voice." But since the Turpins never complained, never argued with anyone, and never drew attention, the community chalked it up to a quiet household. Meanwhile, inside the house, the children learned to hold their breath. They learned to speak in whispers. They learned that any movement could bring punishment. They were taught not to look adults in the eye, not to ask questions, and not to trust notes tucked under pillows or stuffed into lunchboxes. They didn't know about doctors, money, or the outside world. If someone mentioned police, they thought of strangers who might come to lock them away for misdeeds. They felt safer obeying in silence. By late 2017, the children's bodies began to show the signs of years of deprivation. Their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their ribs showed through, and their hair fell out in clumps. Some could barely walk more than a few steps without collapsing. Yet every morning they rose again, dressed again, and sat at the same table in the same silence. And all the while, the Turpins maintained their act. They posted a final holiday picture in December 2017. 13 children in matching blue sweaters, standing in neat rows on a snowy lawn, though that snow was artificial. The smiles were forced, the eyes hollow. The image, beautiful at first glance, masked a horror that no one would believe until the night a child risked everything to press her face against a cold window and call for help. When the front door swung closed behind the police cars that freezing January night, the pale gray paint on the outside seemed almost to glow in the headlights. Inside, the Turpin home was a chamber of horrors no one had ever imagined. The first step across the threshold brought a wave of stench so strong it made officers gag. Rotting food, unwashed bodies, and months, maybe years, of filth pressed into the air itself. The officers moved down a narrow hallway. 6 metal chains dangled from the floorboards, their ends wrapped in old cloth. One chain trailed into a small bedroom where a teenage boy lay curled on a thin mattress. His ankle was shackled. Rust had eaten into the metal and stained the floor. His hair was patchy, and his legs were so skinny that the chain looked almost too large to belong on a human body. He didn't stir when an officer knelt beside him. His eyes were open, but they held no spark, only a hollow confusion. In the kitchen, investigators found empty cans and bowls stacked high on the countertop as if someone had hidden them there. On the table, a single spoon lay beside a bowl with crusted oatmeal. No chairs sat at the table. The children had been forced to stand whenever they ate. The floor tiles were sticky underfoot, and in one corner by the sink, a child had used a small plastic cup as a toilet. When a medical examiner noted this later, she whispered, "I've never seen such degradation." Through the living room, the officers spotted a closet door slightly ajar. Inside was the smallest of the lockdown rooms, a space just large enough to stand in, painted a dull gray with a single bare light bulb hanging overhead. A small padlock secured the latch from the outside. The officers peered in and saw faint chalk marks on the wall, numbers counting up to 50. 50 days locked inside for speaking out of turn, the Turpins' journal had said. In another bedroom, a 12-year-old girl lay on a mattress on the floor. When officers tried to help her up, she screamed and curled into a ball. Her wrists bore the red marks of rope burns where Louise had tied her to the bedpost for refusing to recite a hymn. Her eyes darted with fear as if expecting someone to come back and punish her again. A nurse later described her as skittish, like a wild animal who had been trapped too long. Further down the hall, officers found homemade electroshock devices, wires attached to car batteries and metal clips. Nobody knew how long these had been in use. In Louise's journal, they later discovered instructions for administering shocks to children who refused to obey. The entry was clinical. Monday, 2 shocks to instill respect. Child complied thereafter. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost proud. Each room told a different story of cruelty. One held buckets of rice and beans, portions measured to the gram. Another held nothing but a thin foam pad. In the bathroom, officers saw dirty towels piled high and a single bar of soap almost dissolved away. Toothbrushes stood stiff with dried toothpaste. A social worker who arrived days later said, "It was like stepping into a horror film. There was no humanity left in that house." As the children were led outside, their bodies trembled in the cold night air. 13 faces stared blankly out into a world they barely knew. Many had never felt a proper hug, never heard soothing words, never tasted fresh fruit. One small boy asked for candy. A nurse handed him a lollipop, and he cried from shock at the sweetness. Another girl thanked the officer who helped her down the porch steps as if she were a long-lost friend. In the weeks that followed, the Turpin home was sealed off as a crime scene. Neighbors poured out their disbelief. "I saw them every week at church," one neighbor said. "They were always so polite. I never suspected a thing." Another recalled seeing the children through a window, pressed against the glass like trapped birds. "I thought maybe they were shy," she said. "I was wrong." Inside the county jail, David and Louise sat in separate cells. Louise's face was pale, her shoulders stooped. She confessed quickly, describing punishments in sober detail. David refused to admit he had participated. He said he was following his wife's lead. But the evidence was overwhelming: journals, photos, and the children's testimony. Meanwhile, the children began their long, difficult journey toward healing. At first, they would not let anyone near them. Simple acts like brushing their hair, tying their shoes, or unwrapping a sandwich were terrifying because they were so unfamiliar. Therapists worked with them to relearn basic life skills: how to count money, how to cross the street, how to recognize a car's brake lights. One therapist noted, "It's as if they'd been born yesterday." As the weeks turned into months, the children's bodies slowly healed. Their skin became less translucent, their hair grew back. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. Some had permanent nerve damage from ropes that had cut into flesh for days. Others suffered from severe anxiety and refused to sleep alone. A few needed antidepressants to calm the terror that roared inside whenever they heard a loud noise or saw a door slam. In March 2018, the county opened guided tours of the house for officials, not the public. Psychologists studied the floor plans. Child welfare experts shook their heads. How had so many red flags gone unnoticed? A child's stray bicycle on the lawn, a grocery delivery returned unopened, a frightened neighbor's call. Each single event was dismissed. Together, they painted a clear picture of horror that fell on deaf ears. Back in court, each child took the stand one by one. Their voices were soft at first, but with each testimony, they grew stronger. One teenage girl described living in a locked bedroom for 90 days. No sunlight, no sound except her own breathing. A younger boy recounted being forced to pray on the cold tile floor for hours straight, arms outstretched like a crucifix. Listeners wept as they heard children speak of days without water and nights spent chained to metal. David and Louise listened from the defendant's box, their faces stony. A hush fell over the courtroom when one daughter, her voice clear and steady, looked at them and said, "You took our childhoods. You took our names. We were nothing but prisoners to you." The judge paused, swallowed, and then pronounced the sentences: life in prison without parole. Outside, the media couldn't get enough. Reporters played the 911 call over loudspeakers. Jordan's frightened whisper, "Please help us, please," became a rallying cry for child welfare reform. Talk show hosts debated the case for days. Some blamed the police, others blamed social services. All agreed something had gone terribly wrong. And yet, even as the headlines faded, the Turpin children continued to rebuild their lives. Foster families opened their homes. Schools offered special programs. Therapists became guides through a world that once felt alien. They learned to laugh again, to speak openly, to trust. But on quiet nights, some of them still woke in panic, eyes wide, convinced they were chained in a dark room. That house on North Avenida Madera stands empty now, an ominous shell, its secrets sealed away. But the true horror lives on in the memories of those children, and in the knowledge that cruelty can hide behind the most ordinary of walls. It was just past midnight on January 14, 2018, when 17-year-old Jordan Turpin made the decision that would change everything. For years, she had watched her brothers and sisters suffer. She had felt their hunger, their fear, their endless silence. That night, she crept through the dark hallway in her thin pajamas, careful not to wake her parents. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might wake the house itself. At the end of the hall, she knelt by a window she had pried open weeks earlier. The chill California air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and night flowers. Jordan wrapped her fingers around her secret phone, a cheap old model Louise had thought useless. With shaking hands, she dialed 911 and pressed the phone to her lips. "Hello?" The dispatcher's voice crackled. Jordan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, help us. My name is Jordan. I live at 138 North Avenida Madera, Paris. California, my parents, they're hurting us." She paused, listening to the crackle of the line. Behind her, she heard a faint cry from one of her younger sisters. "They'll kill us if they know. Tell someone." By the time Jordan slipped back to her room, she knew the police were on their way. She lay awake in the dark, wondering how long it would take, and praying they would come before the horror returned. Outside, 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt. Headlights cut through the night, illuminating the neat hedges and the pale gray siding of the house. Officers knocked, announcing themselves. When no one answered, one of them saw a figure slip behind a curtain. Jordan. She threw open the door, her eyes wide, her body trembling. "Please," she said. "It's happening." In minutes, officers fanned out through the house. In the living room, they found the first signs of abuse: dirty dishes, empty food containers, and a single dusty spoon on a table with chairs kicked aside. In the hallway, they saw chains bolted to the floor. In the bedrooms, they discovered children in rags, some chained to beds, some trapped in windowless closets, and all of them shell-shocked. One by one, the officers guided the children outside. They handed them warm blankets, hats, and gloves. Against the January chill, the children stood on the lawn, blinking in the bright floodlights, as medical teams arrived. Nurses knelt before them, offering water and candy. A small boy took a lollipop, his eyes filling with tears at the sweetness. A teenage girl touched an officer's arm and whispered, "Thank you." No one could believe such brutality had existed here, hidden by a smiling family. David and Louise Turpin were found upstairs. They sat calmly as officers placed them in handcuffs. Louise's face was pale, but she showed no tears. David looked angry, as if the intrusion was an offense. In the living room, detectives found Louise's journals, filled with detailed records of punishments. Every entry, from 2 days in the dark room to food withheld for disobedience, was written in neat handwriting. The children were taken to nearby hospitals. There, doctors and social workers confirmed what everyone feared: severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and deep psychological trauma. Some children had broken bones that had healed on their own. Others had rope burns and bruises in faded patterns. The medical team called it one of the worst cases of child abuse we have ever seen. News of the Turpin home spread across the country. The 911 call, Jordan's trembling plea for help, played on news channels and social media. Viewers heard her voice break as she begged for rescue. Experts debated how the system had failed. Church members expressed shock. Neighbors admitted they had noticed odd behavior, but never thought to act. The legal process began swiftly. Prosecutors charged David and Louise with multiple counts of torture, child abuse, and false imprisonment. In court, each of the 13 children testified. Their voices were soft at first but grew stronger with each telling. One daughter described being forced to pray on cold tile for hours. A son recalled the terror of waking to find himself chained by the ankle. Another child spoke of eating a single portion of rice for 2 days straight. Louise Turpin pled guilty to torture. She told the judge she believed she was guiding her children toward righteousness. David maintained his innocence, claiming he had little choice but to follow his wife's rules. The judge listened to hours of testimony and read pages from the journals. When it came time for sentencing in June 2019, the courtroom was packed. The judge called the Turpins' actions a grotesque and unimaginable betrayal. He sentenced each of them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the adults faced justice, the children began a new journey, one of healing. Initially, they resisted help. The world outside felt strange and unsafe. They had to relearn simple tasks: how to hold a toothbrush, how to tie shoelaces, how to cross a street without fear. Therapists taught them about cars, about money, and about personal boundaries. One of the younger girls wept when handed a bedtime storybook. It was the first she had ever held. As months passed, the children's bodies grew stronger. Their skin filled out, their hair grew back, and their bones healed properly. Emotionally, progress was slower but steady. Some of them learned to smile without fear. They found joy in small things: a warm bath, a soft bed, a friendly hug. Siblings who had once been rivals for crumbs of food now comforted one another. In 2020, some of the Turpin children agreed to speak publicly. They sat for interviews, sharing their stories with calm voices and determined eyes. Jordan, once a frightened teenager, became an advocate for abused children. She toured schools to teach kids to recognize signs of abuse. Another sister wrote a memoir about her life in captivity. Others chose privacy, focusing on their studies and new friendships away from the cameras. The Turpin house itself was demolished in 2021. Local officials and the children's attorneys agreed that the building should not stand as a monument to suffering. Today, a vacant lot sits in its place, grass and weeds growing where children once lay chained. A small plaque at the edge of the lot reads simply, "In memory of those who suffered here." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the darkest corners of the Turpin family's story. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another true story, because some nightmares are too real to face alone. Until next time, don't watch alone.